We're very fortunate to have with us Ann Mosle, who is the Executive Director of Ascend, which is the Family Economic Security Program of the Aspen Institute. The Ascend program strives to build a network of leaders and to accelerate policies and community solutions that increase the economic security and educational achievement of vulnerable families, particularly those headed by women. The program focuses on 3 key areas: education, economics, and social capital. Before heading up Ascend, Ms. Mosle served as Vice President and Vice President of the Office of W.K. Kellogg Foundation, Vice President Officer, and among the initiatives she spearheaded at Kellogg was the launch of its $100 million mission-driven investing pilot program. And Ms. Mosle also served as the president of the Washington Area's Women's Foundation for 7 years, and at that foundation she was the lead architect of Stepping Stones, which I know many of you have probably heard of, an initiative to build financial independence for low-income women and their families. Ms. Mosle is on the board of the Tides Network and Foundation and the advisory committee of Oxford University's Said School of Business. Please join me in welcoming Ann Mosle.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
You guys have energy. You can do better than that. Good afternoon. Excellent, excellent. Well, I have to say, I came up this morning from Washington, D.C. I have the pleasure of working at the Aspen Institute, and I was so excited to be with you all. Just the materials, the way that this has been framed up, disrupting the cycle of poverty is exactly the kind of conversation that we would love to be a part of. And so before I just jump in, I really want to thank Beth Babcock and our team for putting this all together and for inviting the Aspen Institute to come here and be a part of it. Thank you, Beth, and your team. And I sort of feel this is probably a room that almost everybody knows each other, or it's maybe just 2 degrees of separation. And so I just want to call out my sort of 1 degree of separation that got me here at the table, although I have a couple other new and old friends here. But really it's Margaret McKenna, who is, one of the public or secret, I'm not sure, assets of the Boston area, but is also a national treasure and one of our fellows of the Ascend program at the Aspen Institute. So I want to say thank you, Margaret, for helping me be here as well. Great. So there's been so much rich conversation. I almost feel it's sort of coming at the end of what has been such a powerful day. It feels quite humbling to be the one standing in front of the room where I just sort of feel the buzz and there's so much action happening here that I'd rather almost be a facilitator of a conversation. And so what I'd like to try to do is kind of walk through some of our learnings and what we're doing through the Aspen Institute, and then hopefully have time for comments and questions to kind of close out what has been a really powerful day. I just sort of feel, Beth said her desired outcomes for this conference were that everybody came here to learn something new, made a new contact, thought about something about how they want to do their work differently. And my goals have already been met, so I can check the box, so I can come on. But it's really to feel that action. It's like the world just needs more of that. So with that said, what I was hoping to share with you today is briefly walk you through some of the learnings we've had through our research. We've done focus groups with low-income parents and families across the country very extensively throughout the fall and this winter. Share a bit about sort of the approach we're embracing, which is called a 2-generation approach, really trying to think about parents and children together, simple yet revolutionary. Talk a bit about what does it mean to take that concept and put it into action, and then share a couple little stories of inspiration of leadership, which I think also reflect leadership in the room, and open up for a conversation. I'm going to try to do the PowerPoint. So first, just very briefly, the Aspen Institute, for those of you that might not know about it, it's a values-based leadership think tank in Washington, D.C. It was created about 1950 after World War II by a group of businessmen, and I do mean businessmen because there weren't that many businesswomen that were rightly recognized at that time, who sort of said, this moment in time in the country, what does our world and society need to look like? Fast forward sort of back in the years, the Aspen Institute hosted some of the very early conversations decades ago about climate change. They introduced the kind of conversations about Middle East peace. They have worked on the issues of huge domestic importance like education, health, and so forth. Ascend is one of their newest programs really thinking about how do we break the intergenerational cycle of poverty. So when we started that work, you could say, okay, here we are, the Aspen Institute, sort of a lofty think tank in the Washington, D.C. area. One of the first things that we did was we went across the country from Albuquerque, Detroit, New York, many other cities, to talk directly to mothers and fathers, single and married, all race and ethnicities, to really ask them about what was going on in their lives, where were their hopes and dreams, what were their hopes and dreams, those for their family and theirs for their children. We worked with a bipartisan team. We are specifically and strategically mission-driven. And sort of 6 key insights that I'd like to share with you that we heard from the parents. And you'll see a couple of the quotes up here. And I think some of the themes that, just by taking a look, if your eyes are better than mine, it seems like being able to pay rent or buy food at the place where you want to be. Stability might be more in my reach than security. Being able to maintain, being able to hold on. So when we went out talking to these parents, and this is a complete listening process, there were 6 things that really jumped out on us, and we have full reports available to anybody if they're interested in learning more. But the first, and I don't think this will surprise anybody, but the true anxiety, stress, frustration that folks feel. And it should also be clear that all the parents that we talked to in the focus groups, they were all low-income parents. And there was one mother who even said, my idea, I would just love to be able to go to the grocery store and buy what I need without anxiety. That basic. And the sort of the frustration level of feeling that kind of your wages are down, your benefits are down, but the cost of living is going up, that pressure cooker, and feeling so frustrated by the lack of leadership from politicians. And so being in focus groups where you have all these different stereotypes and hearing from parents who might be a family of 4 on 15,000, it might be 11,000, it might be 45,000, but all in that sort of range, say, I care about the national debt. I want our country to pay its bills, but I also want our country to pay attention to their future and thinking about our kids. And education is not separate than talking about workforce. And so really, the kind of stewardship that we heard from parents, they weren't looking for a handout. They weren't looking necessarily for the program. They were looking, where can we invest our dollars where they think make the most sense? And we're not seeing that from our political leadership. The second piece was, we saw the 2 key watchwords when we talk about this economy and you talk to low-income parents are economic security and economic stability. Sort of prior to the Great Recession, the conversation was really about economic security. How am I building that house? How am I building that 3 to 6 month window? How am I playing by the rules and moving along? That's gone. That's gone for families. I mean, you all know the numbers. We all probably feel it, the amount of families who have been touched by a job loss or a cut. These are just exacerbated for the families that you are working with, and they're also here in the room going. And just looking at how the shift to stability, it's like, I'm looking to make it to next week. I'm looking to make it to next week, not just next month. And the word opportunity has been one, especially as you approach election season. The opportunity, the American dream. That is something that feels even further away. And so as we think about how do you really open up a national conversation and really bring all parents' voices in, we have to be really humble about how most people are really seeing, feeling, and experiencing the world, and how do we connect to that. Third insight was the importance of education, and that education is absolutely essential to all children's lives. And that parents are also feeling it's getting more and more difficult to attain. That was discussed in many of the panels, just this sort of dichotomy of how critical, but yet how elusive it's becoming. Mothers especially saw education not just as a commodity, but also really as a value, and a valuing of our society. It was interesting when the parents talked about their education. They sort of said, yes, education's great, I want to learn more, but it absolutely has to be connected to a job. It has to be connected to a tangible career advancement. Sort of the time, and I think it came up, we had the pleasure of sitting in on the session with some of the women who are participants or graduates of some of the programs with CFO and FII and others, but there's no slack time. You know, people are working 24/7, and if that education avenue doesn't lead to a result, these are very no-nonsense women. That's what they're focused on. 4, family, friends, and places of faith are some of the most effective places when people talk about where do I go to for support. Public sector government didn't necessarily, when you were talking about where are you going, sometimes there are a few nonprofit or community programs, but people and families were really looking to one another. If I didn't have my husband's mother, my mother to be there for childcare, if my neighbor wasn't there on the corner, if my church did not hand out the basket of food, it was that real, that close. And these were, you know, a series of focus groups across race and ethnicity across the country. And so again, there's great power in that. How do we think about that? And then fifth, one thing that we really teased out was really talking to single parents. This is something, when you look at some of the data and the shifts that we've had over the past 10 years, the OECD came out with a pretty significant report this fall that just kind of captured the incredible spike we have in our country compared to all industrial and all other industrialized countries, looking at the growth of children growing up in single-parent families. We're not in the business of to get married, not to get married. I say, thank goodness, every morning my husband's still with me. Thank you. We're not in the business of promoting or not going to marriage, but we're really making sure how are young people raised to have all the affirmative pathways they can to make the best decisions they can make, and really understanding what's going on in single-parent families. So with that, it was quite fascinating. We saw, especially with the single mothers, incredible resilience, incredible strength. They were, of all the population, the only population that still believed the future would be better for their children and for themselves. Some could say, well, that's because it's a little bit harder road. But when we have more than half of the US population for the first time in our history thinking that the future is not necessarily going to be better, that's a major psyche tipping point. But if you're thinking about who's going to also be the backbone of pulling through, there's a real resilience in some of the single mothers and women who are backbones of their families for us to really think about from a strength perspective, not just a need. It was interesting as we talked to some of the single fathers, because that number is also increasing as well. And really what their needs were. Both said, single mothers said it's so hard raising boys, and single fathers said it's so hard raising daughters. And how do we come together and think differently about it? And both groups talked about how it's harder for single parents, but it was interesting, the sort of simmering resentment towards single mothers. And I know we have some folks from the Pew Center here, which also does fantastic sort of attitude analysis. And it is true that single mothers are probably one of the least sort of well-embraced populations in our society. And what are we doing to think about that? And it was really interesting, even when we asked some of the men, of which in this one focus group, the majority had been raised by a single mother, if they felt that there should be any extra supports, they said no. and I know there's no wrong or bad. It was I've had more time to process. But it speaks to some really deep pain. It speaks to some really deep pain, and I think it also speaks to a lot of divides. Without question, when we talked to any of the populations, they said whatever policies or programs one is undertaking, in this case we are really trying to get the parent voice before we're off and running, was it has to be inclusive. You can be focused in how you're thinking about how you run your institution. You might think about how your community college does on-site childcare, or how there's on-site economic supports because there might be less room to go. But don't call it a program just for one population. And I just thought, you know, it's something where we all, and having come from the Kellogg Foundation, which was a very privileged position to give away money, and people talk a lot about results and being focused. We have to be really careful when we are focused how we also communicate, and that we're always bringing people together and not creating unintended divides. The other last thing that was very interesting was we think a lot about gender. And for us, our mission is to serve as a hub for both the breakthrough ideas and the proven strategies that move parents, especially women and their children, beyond poverty towards economic security and educational success. Little wordy, but you all are sort of program people. We wanted to make a very strong statement about women, but we also wanted to talk about whole family. And so we probed about gender. It was interesting, and so we play a lot, we think a lot about gender and race in our work. there were sort of one headline that came out when we talked that was different from mothers and fathers that underscored some of the past research on gender as it relates to children. One, when you asked men what was their top priority, it was to achieve financial security. And of course, it was financial security to have a good life, to care for one's family. When you asked women, it was to care for my children. And I think it's just one of the things when we think about how this work happens, how do we marry those worlds together? And so that's just a bit of a snippet, but we really wanted to take the time to go out and hear from parents first. And one of the, is it moving here? One of the things, the last thing that came across both when the focus group information went out and the ongoing work was just the absolute hunger out there for solutions. And I think I said to Beth, I said, when I saw the kind of panel, the kind of people you had here, I'll have the plane and come on up. I mean, this is a group of people talking about solutions, talking about what's work, talking about what's the ROI. Those are the right kind of conversations, and the world is so desperate for them at all levels. So just a couple data points to sort of ground a little bit of our work at Aspen is when we think about our work, one of the things that figures that keeps us up at night is certainly looking at the more than 1 in 5 children who are living in poverty. And then, more importantly, or even just taking it further, is 2 in 5, 40% of our children are growing up in low-income families. And when we think about that, and we think about the connections between poverty and education and prosperity for our family or what our country needs, we have one big train wreck waiting. And we really have to think very differently about this and think about sort of 2 generations at one time. When we also think, oh gosh, they got too fancy again. So we've got the educational data, but then when we talk about why also focusing on women, the majority of the when we look at where a lot of the low-income children are concentrated, they are in women-headed families. We really need to think, you might be a feminist, you might be about women, but you have to think that's the closest lever. And again, within a family context, but we really want to follow the data to where are the children. And then lastly, the last statistic just came out in the most recent White House report that looks at the kind of decisions or choices mothers have to make and fathers have to make when they look at daycare center fees for an infant exceeding average annual rent payments in 24 states. And then in 40 states, these fees were higher than a year's tuition and related fees at a 4-year public college. So when we talk about a 2-generation strategy, we're making choices that just don't make sense in the short or the long term. So on this 2-generation strategy, this is something we've been doing a lot of work looking at promising practices and model programs and leadership. Very simply, it's looking for where are the opportunities, creating opportunities for, and addressing the needs of parents and children together. So simple, so hard to do. Expensive, holistic, how do you get the kind of results you're looking for? But we have, some programs will start first, I'm really working with the parents or the mothers or the fathers, and then realize you can only go so far without the children. Some programs, really starting with the children, you can't take a child out of their family or their community. We have to think about this in a more whole family sort of way. And so when we talk about the approach, oh, sugar, I'm really bad at this. Okay, so y'all, there you go. When we think about the 2-generation approach, for us, we sort of see 3 core components. And these are, we sort of looked at them as the 3 biggest levers, but it's really, one of the things we really try to talk about, there are not sort of silver bullets out there. We all want them, we all want scale, and we have to always be working towards that, but we realize this is really complicated problems. Beth won my heart over when she sort of had the comment this morning that this is not my grandmother's poverty. This is a very complicated world. But yet we have to make sense of it with all the tools and the advanced understandings we have. So for us, again, I talk a lot about education. Education is a continuum. We think of this as a scaffold of levers. Certainly, one of the strongest footholds is in the early childhood space. It goes on up through K-12, but then the other real foothold is post-secondary education. If you're thinking about 2-generation strategies, we've got to think about early childhood and post-secondary education together. When you look at the poverty numbers that came out, everybody knows this in the room, both by the data point or intuition. The most vulnerable families in our country are young parents and young kids. We have a very clear intervention point. And so how do we start linking that together? And just to sort of embarrass Margaret McKenna a little bit, she did really transformative work when she was at Lesley College. Just how did she really change a culture of an institution, the number of students that were being served and how they were served. One of her proteges is now running Endicott College here in your area as one of our Ascend Fellows, where they have the Keys to Degrees program. And it's doing residential housing for single parents that provides high-quality early childhood education, nutritional assistance, financial assistance. They're just starting to graduate folks, but with that intervention, they're getting 2 generations right there. I dare say there's a cost-benefit analysis that would probably go on the benefit side coming out of that. When we look at the economic supports, how do we think about the economic supports, be they earned income tax credits, childcare, housing assistance, WIC, how do those come together in ways that are more bundled and co-located and where the population of the families are? Someone said in the panel earlier today, I meet families where they are. Well, we've had a lot of discussions years past about how do we make families more accountable. I actually think let's have the second half of the conversation about how to make systems more accountable and just more darn effective. I think a lot of the work we have ahead of ourselves is not really sexy stuff. It's really how do we make stuff work better. We're going out actually next, in 2 weeks, my team, to go work with the Human Services Director of the state of Colorado to help facilitate a retreat as he brings together his, all of his crew. They have, over his purview, they have 23 services that reach low-income families. All the early childhood stuff, and then some of the parent supports. What if they all work together? And they had a shared dashboard about how that kind of came together. Imagine how much money they could save and maybe make a difference in some people's lives. So kind of trying to bring some of those worlds together. And then lastly is the social capital piece. And this is something that you can feel the social capital in this room. And I think one of the most exciting models out there who's here today is the Family Independence Initiative. This is really talking about the power of people and relationships and networks. And really looking at how to, first of all, how is an individual recognized? How are we building from the strength? How do families support one another? How do they go to nonprofits in their community? How are networks built? Because for any of us in this room, most of us got to where we are through the power of relationships. And what holds one of us together holds us all together. And so this is something, it's a new area that we're really trying to look at. How do we build a field out of this? Okay, I'm going to have to fire myself in the PowerPoint world. I do not know how to use Mac, even though Walter Isaacson was Mr. Steve Jobs. Clearly, I'm an IBM person. Okay, so it's up there now. So when we think about how do we apply a 2-generation frame and look at the approaches, it can't come from one field. We have to work across disciplines. We really have to cross-pollinate, which again was why when I saw what Crittenton was putting together here and bringing people together. Because if research isn't connected to policy, if policy is not connected to systems change, we're just kind of running around not doing the best work. So when we talk about policies and we think about a 2-generation lens, there's a lot of great asset building work that's happening. Children's savings account. How do we think about saving for children's education in the beginning and tying that and linking that to financial education? We talk about programs. How does a community college link and provide a Head Start Center, start innovating in a programmatic way? Systems I talked about with the state of Colorado is thinking to take on. I'm sure by the time next year, Beth will have all of Massachusetts on a new model halfway. On research, I was really excited. I missed the panel this morning about looking at research and building the return on investment. There's a group of economists we're actually trying to bring together. So Dr. Otis, you're welcome to join. But really, if we don't build in the case and we don't think about what's the benefit and what's the cost to build a numbers case, you just have to be able to do that if you're making that kind of change. So as we move forward, we have sort of 3 strategies, which I think you've been doing all day, so we're just here to catch up to you. Is one, really, we got to elevate what's working. And I think a lot of what's working is going to be happening at the community, at the state level over the next 2 years. It's a really tough time in Washington. People apparently need to learn how to talk to each other again. My husband works on the Hill. I get it. It's a little bit, I mean, the gridlock that we have right now is just not okay. But with that in mind, I do think the pressure, the ideas, and the solutions are going to come from communities like Boston, like Denver, like New Mexico, just because there's great stuff happening. When I think about what Crittenton's putting together here, bringing research, bringing program, thinking about systems and advocacy, bringing that together, thinking about the collective impact you can have, that's where I think some of the real innovation is going to happen and get scaled up. Second, we need to be thinking about working in a networked way. I think the world of like sort of build the best organization is a bit of price of admission. We really have to think, whether it's across sectors or within sectors, how are we able to network with one another? It's not easy, but no one organization can do it by themselves. No family can do it by themselves. And how are we coming together? And as we come together, how are we thinking about building the political will? Because if we don't have the political will, we don't have the power to make the change. And so we want to be front and center about putting that up front. And then lastly, we're really trying to drive it towards how do we fundamentally change the conversation. Change the conversation around low-income families and in our communities. And with that, it's really about starting from a place of strength, a place of resilience, a place of engaging families. Sorry, guys. So, but again, just sort of seeing the pathway, you've got to find the solutions, you've got to think about the network, and you've got to think about how does that lead towards really changing the conversation. So, sort of moving forward, we'd like to think about a new way of working. And for us, when we started the Aspen Institute, okay, I finally got the last slide, I get it. It's pathetic. On your evaluations, just be kind. Lord help me. This was something, I had the privilege of having worked in the field for about 20 years. And I've worked on many sides of, whether it's in philanthropy for a foundation, on the ground, I've worked in reservations out in the West. And I've had a chance to try to learn a little bit. And one of the things that, when the opportunity came up at the Aspen Institute to do this, was it wasn't about creating an organization. It was creating a container that could bring some of the best folks from across the country and other partners to try to come together and focus on what's working, try to build some shared sense of metrics and learning, and really try to build an agenda. And one of the things that the Aspen Institute, I just have to brag on it a little bit because I have nothing to do with it, was I told you about where it started in 1950, sort of being the businessman model. Fast forward now, the chair of our program committee is Madeline Albright. I mean, these are folks, talking about moving the conversation beyond the choir and saying we need to put these issues front and center. That's a real sea change kind of opportunity. And so we have a fellows program. So a lot of our resources are designed to go out into the field, see what's working, try to help amplify that, and then support real leaders doing outstanding work. So these are just a couple examples that some of you might know a few of them. But I wanted to raise them up for different reasons. The first woman is Vivian Nixon. Vivian is head of the College and Community Fellowship Program. She is a woman who made a mistake, went to jail at Albion College, just down the road from Kellogg Foundation, realized her mistake when she was in prison, wanted to get involved in faith, and really develop her education. She realized there were no pathways there for that. When she graduated, she helped start she became a reverend, and she also created the community, the College and Community Fellowship Program. And it really works to help women with criminal convictions to come back and be full contributing members of society. This is something, you may or may not be looking, but if you look at the numbers of mothers and fathers, men and women going into incarceration, and the issues around reentry, this is a major problem for our country that we're not talking about. We're not talking about from a solution perspective. Her program started around 2003. Since the beginning, they've already had almost 200 participants complete their college and graduate degrees. Fewer than 2% have fallen back into the system. She's running a pretty much a shoestring operation. She's now syncing up, they're working in all the prisons in New York City, trying to think about how it goes into systems. But when we think about these big problems, like what are we going to do? There are some real answers. And I think about the leaders like Vivian and how bold they are in creating pathways that are working. The second is sort of a hometown leader, Kara Ailey, who I don't know, we've got a representative, Brenda, from American Mojo. But we really, we wanted to make sure that when we did this, that we didn't let the private sector stand the sidelines. certainly didn't want just corporate support. We really said, how are we going to move the markets? And so one of the things that really, American Mojo, for those of you who don't know them, is an apparel manufacturing company based here in Lowell. It's looking to expand in New Orleans and not Detroit.
San Francisco.
San Francisco. It's working on a model where it has a preference. It's Kara and her two brothers that created this. They're both raised by a single mother. And they're looking at how they run their company differently. It's looking at how, for the women employees, what kind of wages are they getting? What kind of training are they getting? What's the child care? What's the employee stock option program? It's not all perfect. She's learning and growing and watching in the fellowship pick up different models. But it's creating a company that says we're going to do this differently, and some of our metrics for success. We still need to make money, but we want to look at our employees in a different way and also through a two-generation lens. Then the third one is Carla Davis. Carla Davis is someone who comes out of community work and now is working with Governor Haslam down in Tennessee, a Republican governor, from her purview as Commissioner of Labor, to really go across the systems and think, how do we work from a systems perspective differently in the state of Tennessee? And so when she looks at her budget of $220 million, more than 2,000 employees, how does she more effectively harness her resources to really meet the needs of Tennessee families? And so just kind of opening up those different kind of conversations. And then the last one that I added was the Chamber's Family Fund. And this is something where they're one of our partners. It's a foundation based in Colorado. It's a foundation with a three-pronged mission, really to think about women's economic self-sufficiency, early childhood and development, and social justice. And they really joined us with a major way, and both in not just financial support, but also hosting meetings, sharing their research, getting involved, also using their voice. Meryl, as a philanthropist, also is a CEO of an oil company. When she talks about these issues, it's a little bit different than sort of a grassroots perspective, and we need all voices. And so as we think about going forward, and as you're doing your work, how do you also bring in all philanthropists, but also women philanthropists, really specifically, to speak out and be ambassadors on the issues? I think we just have a huge opportunity there. So, speed dating is my last one. So kind of in closing, because I'm really excited to kind of get into conversation, I'm sure you all have a lot to say, you've been doing a lot of great work, is Kate Boo is one of my just all-time sheroes. And I don't know if many of you have read her work, but she did a seminal piece in the New Yorker back in, oh gosh, the early 1990s, that was about a woman, Elizabeth Jones, who's now Elizabeth Jones Bradshaw, but who grew up in Anacostia in Washington, D.C. It was at the time I was at the Washington Area Women's Foundation. We had about myself and an intern. We had about $30,000 in bank. We were very humble. We still are. But this article was about what Elizabeth's journey was to go from welfare to work. And Kate lived with her. And Kate sort of walked the path with her. And we've all become friends, but she went through this program, Elizabeth Jones, who Kate wrote about, and went with her and lived with her as she lived in an unsafe neighborhood. Was trying to raise 4 children, one with very challenging special needs, going through the public school system, going through charter systems, going through different programs, job training programs, fail, finally gets through a police training, which is a woman going into a non-traditional job, sort of breaks the odds there. Talks about her job going through the nights on the night shift. She's running down the alley after after a robber, wondering, oh my gosh, are my children safe at home? The conversation in the back of your head while you're also running down trying to get to somebody might have robbed a bank or something. But the thing was great. Not only did Kate put this story out in a way that it opened up an incredible conversation at the time around welfare reforms, another stage of it, the conversation continued. I've since sort of continued to work with Kate as she's worked on different issues. I've actually had the pleasure of testifying before Congress with Elizabeth Jones, who was the police officer and has found her voice to be an advocate. And I guess it was in the spring of 2007. I remember when we all were instant messaging. I got this little instant message from Elizabeth Jones, who she sent me this little ping, and she said, "My daughter just got into college. the first generation is going to college. And it was sort of Kate as a journalist, this sort of sideline person. She opened up all these relationships and connections and power because of the story she told and the way she told it. And so she's recently come back from India, where she's written an incredible book about sort of the slums of India and what's happening there. But she had this quote that I just thought was so powerful, and I'll close with that. If change is to happen, it will be because people with power have a better sense of what's happening to people who have not. And I think some of the conversations we think about as we think about power and voice, how many of you as leaders and connectors in this community open up that power, which will actually make us all stronger. So with that said, it's really been an honor and a privilege to have a few minutes to share just a touch of our work and our thinking. And I just wish you all the very, very best in what you're doing. And we're looking forward to continuing to learn and hopefully partner with what you're doing here. So thank you.